Well, good evening, gentlemen. It's great to be with you all again, as always. And as Brother Kirk Mulhern pointed out, it is in fact creation and evil that we will be discussing tonight. Now, you recall last week, or last session, whenever it was, you recall that we spoke about the nature of God and the nature of reality. Well, we got a little bit into the question of creation last week, but now we're really going to do it in. Because before we could begin to discuss the history of the church and the world, we really have to know a little bit about the nature of things. So, first and foremost, you recall that last week we said that God, as a Trinity, was in a continual state of self-love, and yet a community of love, you might say. This is his whole motivation. Now, mind you, we also said last week that due to our human limitations, we often do not know what love is. And the emotions and so forth that we use that word for are not necessarily recognizable by us, particularly the more sinful we are in the actions of God. Well, first thing you have to know about the creation is that it was an act of love. Plain and simple. And as love is in its highest state, had nothing to quote-unquote justify it. He did it because he felt like it. He did it because he wanted to. The Catechism, of course, tells us that he did it for his own glory and honor. Well, that's true. And that too is love. We tend to forget that about God. He continues to sustain our existence and the existence of everything all the time. He wills us to continue in existence, and he does so as an act of love. It's very important to bear in mind. He doesn't do it to torture us, although sometimes it seems kind of hard to believe that. He doesn't do it because he has nothing better to do, because he's bored. He does it because he loves us. And one reason why it's important to bear this in mind is because when we sin, we throw that love right back at his face and laugh at him. We don't know what we do. Our Lord himself said that when he was put up on the cross. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. But you see, we have to try and figure out what we're doing. We go through our lives due to our human fallen natures as though we were in a fog. We have to try and pierce that fog. And, unfortunately, mere knowledge by itself isn't enough. But we'll talk about that later. Now, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be light." That was the act of creation. And he called out of absolute nothingness. He called everything into being. And this is an important thing also to bear in mind. When we think of God as a maker, we unconsciously, a creator, we unconsciously have in our minds all of the examples of people who make things around us, and they all take things. Carpenters take wood, writers take what's left of their brains, and so on. But God did it all out of absolute nada, zero. Do you realize that it's actually virtually impossible for us to really conceive of what nothing is? Because we're something. Imagine a total absence of anything. You can't really. You could sort of get an idea of it, but as I've often had cause to use this simile before, and no doubt will again, it's like trying to show a blind man red. One who's always been blind and has never been able to see. But out of this nothing, he called into being everything. With that one phrase, which in Latin we say, fiat lux, let there be light. Now, having said that, let us look for a moment at what people like to call today the new physics. I don't know if you know that phrase, the new physics, but it's actually rather an exciting one. Because the sort of 19th century science that you and I were brought up with in school, and certainly that our parents were, is more and more being proved false. And it's interesting to study the conclusions of the new physicists, because inevitably they've got to try and explain away their own facts. Time and again, they'll say, after they reveal some startling new discovery, like, say, the fact that all the galaxies and stars are equally spaced. They're all expanding outwards, but they all keep the same distance. And they're all equally, regularly, carefully spaced. So what do the discoverers of this interesting fact have to tell us? Of course, that doesn't mean that there was a creator. And time and again, they have to say this. The problem is, when you've got 1,000 different new discoveries on 1,000 different fronts in science, and time again, they have to tell you, of course, despite the appearance, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's a creator. And then you put them all together. Well, okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a creator, but only if anything makes sense. And this, it would require, in the face of the new physics, I think, a greater act of faith to disbelieve in God. If one really knows this stuff, it takes a conscious act of will to disbelieve in God, which scientists are quite capable of because they've got strong wills. Anyway, and also I should say that isn't all scientists. More and more of them are turning into believers precisely because of these sorts of discoveries. Well, one of the interesting things that has surfaced in recent years, and some scientists, interesting creatures that they are, will attempt to use this as, I don't know quite how they figure it out, proof against the existence of God. Nevertheless, it is the Big Bang. I love that phrase, the Big Bang. It reminds me very much of a party I went to when I was in college. But never mind, that's another story. But the Big Bang is the notion that everything in the cosmos erupted from an extremely tiny central point and just has been going out ever since. And when you say to scientists, well, what happened at that one central point when all matter in the cosmos was crammed into an area about the size of my fist? What was it doing there? Was it on somebody's shelf? What was the point? Well, we don't really know. Maybe what happens is it expands and contracts like a blood vessel. Like the biggest migraine you ever had. No, they have no answer for it. But you see, Revelation gives us an answer. And the answer is, fiat lux. God said, let there be light. And there was. Now, that act of creation brought into being out of nothing, ex nihilo for the Latin scholars amongst us, a substance that, again, you've never seen, but which philosophers and so forth have talked about for years and years and years. And what is it? It's called the prima materia, the prime matter. That matter from which everything has been made. You don't know what it is? I don't know what it is. You don't know what it looks like? I don't know what it looks like. Except that we're all made out of it. And everything around us. And this is the stuff from which God has molded everything. The prime matter. The prima materia. Now then, you may recall last time I spoke about the fight between two major schools of thought, the Aristotelians and the Neoplatonists. What I have to go into now is going to rely a great deal on Neoplatonism. And as I said last time, I don't mind doing that because that was the philosophy used by the early church fathers, by St. Augustine, by many popes. And what's really interesting about it is that it has much, much more in common with the modern new physics and things like that than Aristotelianism, which Aristotelianism, you see, is basically a materialistic philosophy. And so all of the 19th century science was based on it, and things like that. Well, having said that, here's your first Neoplatonic concept. Are you all ready? The rational seeds. Rationes seminalis. Semines rationes. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean stuff that comes in a burpee bag and thinks for itself? No. What the philosophers meant by this was that in each created item there are the seeds of further growth and development. In the acorn, for instance, an acorn is not an oak tree, but it has in it the seeds of development to become an oak tree. Similarly, Adam and Eve had in them all the genes of all the folk that would ever be. And here, too, is where your new science comes in, because as all of us may know, 5 or 6 years ago, all of the female chromosomes in existence were tracked down to a single female ancestor. And at that time, I remember the big buzz was, well, it would be too tough to trace down all the male chromosomes with our current ideas and our current technology. And some people even went on to say that perhaps the first female human, who's the sum total of all these genes, was a polyandrist and had a harem of males. And maybe we all have different, at least male ancestors. Well, no such luck. This year, apparently, the technology has gotten to the point to where they were able to trace back all the male chromosomes to a single male ancestor. Well, does it take a real genius to figure out that maybe the first male repository and the first female repository knew each other? Maybe they were introduced at a dance, who can tell? But nevertheless, and of course at the same time, our dear friends, the explainers away, replied, well, of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that they were the first couple. It just means we can trace everything back to them. I read this and I had a very hard time keeping a straight face. In fact, I lost it. But anyway, the genes are an example, though far from the only one, of these rational seeds of the philosophers. There is within each of us, physically and spiritually, all sorts of possibilities which may or may not come out. If you have a cancer cell, for instance, that was in there from the beginning. The blueprint was there. It just required certain circumstances to bring it out, whatever those might have been. If you were, there are a lot of things that will never come to fruition. For instance, you may remember about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, they had the Thalidomide babies. And of course, now they've got them again in Latin America. And these were kids who, because their mothers took a drug called thalidomide, they were born without arms and legs, with little flippers. Well, what that tells you is that in the human genetic code, there are flippers. But these seeds, mind you, these rationes seminis, can only go so far. You see. They can only go so far. There are a restricted number of things. When I say restricted number, to us, the being human as we are and being sort of small creatures, the possibilities seem endless. But from an infinite point of view, they aren't. For instance, to us, a wolf, a jackal, a chihuahua, an Irish wolfhound, an old English sheepdog, all seem very, very different. But actually, they're the same animal. They're the same creature. How do we know this? It's very simple. It's because you can breed a chihuahua with a timber wolf and come up with fertile offspring who will produce more kids. And that's how we know, by the way, that the horse and the donkey are not the same animal, because mules don't reproduce. That is the difference between species, biologically. And that's the only difference. It doesn't matter what they look like. And yet, no matter what they look like, you can't cross a certain boundary with them. You could breed a dog to where it looks very much like a rabbit. I know, I've seen them. Sort of. Kind of. But you know what? Couldn't breed it with a rabbit. Even use artificial insemination, you won't get anything out of it. Nothing will happen. So, contrary-wise, as long as something is in the genes, as it were, in a larger scale in these rational seeds, it can never really be lost. Give you an example. I don't know if all of you are familiar with this, but there is in Europe an animal called the European Bison, which looks very much like the American bison. And in fact can interbreed with it, so it's really the same animal, though it looks rather different. Now, the last refuge of this creature was in a big forest in Poland, and they all got wiped out in World War I. But there were small groups of them in different zoos around Europe. So what happened was that these two brothers, the directors of the Munich and Berlin zoos, oddly enough, Germans, they gathered together in one place every European bison they could get their hands on. And from that, they were able to breed enough of them to where now you've got European bisons in different parts of European forests again. And they were so stoked with success that they turned their attention to another animal, the cow. Now, the cow is a descendant of a wild animal called an aurochs. And of course, the aurochs was no Elsie. Okay, we're not talking about a sweet little creature that gave milk. No, the aurochs was a fierce, bloody thing. And it was more akin to the Spanish bullfighting bulls or to some of our longhorn cattle. It was not a nice creature. It was a wild animal. But they were hunted to extinction. The last one died in 1629 in another forest in Poland. Apparently, the Poles were not very rigorous in hunting out their animals. Well, these two brothers, fresh from their success with the bison, thought, gee, if you could breed forward to get an animal, maybe you could breed backward. So what did they do? They collected up individuals from different cattle breeds that the most resembled the old aurochs. And they started breeding first for appearance. Eventually, they came up with an animal that bred true. That is to say, you could keep on generation after generation and they won't have any domestic features at all. And they look just like the old aurochs. But a lot of scientists said, well, wait a minute, they can't really be the same animal. They can only look like the same animal. But here's the fun part. They released them into the wild. And they have precisely the same habits, mating seasons, that domestic animals don't have. All the sorts of things that the old aurochs did, and which have been bred out of domestic cattle, these things did. So, what's the point of all of this? I should say that they later did something similar with the horse, and rebred the tarpan, which became extinct in the 1820s. Now, what's the point of all of this? The point is that a thing is itself. It has within it the rational seeds, the seminis rationes, which can allow for all sorts of development backwards and forwards, and all kinds of variety, which permit it to deal with different conditions. But it will never become, at base, at root, something different. And this is the problem, gentlemen, with evolution. Because genetics blows evolution all to pieces. And then you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, all of this was foreshadowed by those church fathers and those Neoplatonic philosophers. How did they know? Don't know. I don't know. Nevertheless, it's true. So when you see that phrase in the books, seminis rationes, rational seeds, you know what it means. And it's a very important concept. Because just as when God called forth everything and said, let there be light, the prime matter appeared. In it were all of these possibilities, all undifferentiated. Now remember, we spoke earlier about the universals. These being the images of different things in the mind of God, man, horse, etc. These universals were, as it were, the patterns which God used to work upon the prime matter, and which he continues to do in our own day. Now, this brings us next to two very important concepts. Why am I saying all of this stuff? Is it simply to throw new words at you? No. It is because unless you have a thoroughly Catholic understanding of the nature of reality, the very basic nature of reality, you will tend to accept, to a great degree, the mainstream's views of things, which are based upon the idea that matter is a dead thing, that all you can see is all there is, that if there is a spiritual realm, it doesn't interact, that if there is a God, he's sort of a watchmaker way off somewhere. No, he isn't. So, that's why. Two more concepts that are fun to keep in mind are form and substance. What are these? What do these basically mean? Substance is the stuff you're made of, matter. And matter, what distinguishes matter from non-matter? Matter has potential. Matter can change. Remember the rationes, the semines rationes again. Matter has the potential to change. Non-matter doesn't. God cannot change because he has no matter. Now, form is the shape, the pattern of things. When the church says that the soul is the essential form of the body, what they are saying is that your individuality, your personhood, even your physical being is dependent upon the soul that God gave you. You yourself were made, as they say, from earth, from the substance of your parents, your physical being was. But it conforms in great degree to the soul that was put in it. Or to put it another way, the soul is what makes you what you are, not the body. So, we say that we have a soul as though it were a sock that we could take off. No. We are a soul. It's when you'll hear people say, "I want to save my soul," and of course it's a good phrase and it's perfectly fine. The church uses it all the time, but for a lot of people, it's as though, saving your soul is like saving some money in the bank. No. It's saving yourself, you, the essential you, the you that was an embryo, that was a fetus, that was an infant, that was a kid, that is a youth or middle-aged, that will age and die. Then your soul and body will separate for a time. Your soul, you will carry on all by yourself. Your body will be dust. And then, at the last trump, your body will be reassembled, come back to you. And you and your body will spend eternity in heaven or hell. And yet, that whole vast thing is one person, the essential you. So, anyway. Now this brings us to another important question, which was argued about quite a bit in the Middle Ages. The question of subtle matter. Now, you know, of course, that the soul and angels and so forth can't be seen. They can't be touched, generally speaking. They can touch you, we see from the lives of the saints and things like that. They can leave marks, we see in the Bible. You remember the book of Tobias, when St. Raphael is running around doing all kinds of things. Yet, he's a spirit. So the question that agitated them, and it'll be very important in a moment, was, what are spirits made out of? Well, early on, when all the church fathers were Neoplatonists and so on, they declared that the angels were made of subtle matter. Now remember what they said matter was. Matter is capable of change. That's why we know God has none, because he can't change. You can say, well, wait a minute. Can the angels change? They did. Some of them did, anyway. They did have the capacity to be other than they were created. And some of them, as we'll see in a minute, some of them did become other than they were created. So in that one little regard, they had the ability to change. They had the ability to affect things. And so, way back when, the church philosophers declared that angels and human souls had this subtle matter, much, how do I put it, much lighter than gross matter, which is what they call our bodies and everything you see around us, able to move through walls and do all that kind of stuff, and yet able to affect things. Now later on, when Aristotle was rediscovered, the notion came up, and this was championed by St. Thomas, that angels and souls have no matter whatsoever. They are merely form and will. We know what will is. the basic motive force of your personality. Well, I can tell you that's a relatively new notion in the history of the church, even though it's virtually everyone holds it. So here's another one of the things that caused the Neoplatonists and the Aristotelians to throw daggers at each other during the Middle Ages. But we'll get to that much later on, those particular fights. But keep that notion of subtle matter in mind. Now, another question that came up in those days, and again, it's important, it has important repercussions, is the multiplicity of substantial forms. Isn't that great? One of the great things about philosophy is A, it's easy to forget, and B, it gives you all kinds of $3 words that nobody else will understand. So you could introduce these into conversations at parties and so on. People look at you cross-eyed. But the multiplicity of substantial forms is an important notion also. Why is it? Because it goes back to deciding who you are and making you what you are. You see. Remember the universals again. Man, horse, love, etc. All of us are the confluence of several different universals at once, several different qualities. Take Kirk. All right, Kirk is corporeal. He's not an angel or a pure spirit or a soul, disembodied. We know that. So that's one universal to which he belongs, and so he has, as it were, one substantial form. Secondly, he's a man. Thirdly, he's a Caucasian. Fourthly, he's male. Fifthly, and most important, he's Kirk. But he's the sum total of all of these different items, all of which play their part in making him the individual that we know. Now, I know all of these are notions and ideas that probably sound a great deal like gibberish as I put them out like this. I'm sorry about that. There's really very little I could do because generally you have to sort of study these things an awful lot and read a lot about them. But what the effect of this is, the effect of this notion of the multiplicity of substantial forms is that it makes each of us not just individuals, but the sum total of an awful lot of different things. It's a much easier way to understand why a given human being is the way he is. It's an easier way to understand yourself once you get into it a bit. If you look at all creation as a set of interlocking forms, if you realize that every individual thing is the subtotal of a lot of other things, then you understand that everything in creation is interconnected. Everything is linked to everything else. And this idea is going to become very important toward the end of tonight's talk. When we do questions, if there are specific aspects of any of this stuff that you're particularly curious about, ask me and I'll try and make more sense of it. Otherwise, later on in these talks, we'll deal with other aspects individually. All right. One other thing we have to point out. Throughout creation, there are two qualities that are everywhere and can't be avoided. They are masculine and feminine. I don't mean male and female. Those are mere reflections. Masculine and feminine, passive and active. In one sense, God is supremely masculine because he is the actor. Everything else in creation, on a certain level, on the highest level, simply responds to him. Good, bad, or indifferent. Everything is a response to God's action. That's why he manifests himself to us in male form. You see, there's a purpose for that. That's also why the spiritual writers always call the soul she. It's not because they were feminists, in case you were wondering. It's because God acts upon the soul reacts to the action of God. But that masculine-feminine thing is in every bit of creation, and it's from the interaction of it that everything we see has existence. It's also interesting to note in this area the figure of wisdom in the Old Testament. Now, wisdom is always represented as a female figure, the wisdom of God. In the liturgy and in the church fathers, that figure of wisdom is always seen as a prefiguring of Our Lady. Now, I've got to be careful with what I say at the moment, because an awful lot of what I'm saying, the New Agers were kind enough to hijack and turn into all sorts of weird stuff. But understand, we're not dealing with New Age here. You might say we're dealing with Old Age. We're going way back. In a nutshell, the figure of wisdom in the Old Testament, the eternal feminine, as the goddess worshippers and nun priests and things like that will talk about, was the image of the Virgin Mary in God's mind from all eternity. It's been said by many spiritual writers that, again, in a certain sense, all that was created for her, for the Virgin Mary. And in a sense, but not, when I say in a sense, don't take this too literally. In a sense, Mary is the incarnation of the divine wisdom in a way, as our Lord was the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. But again, it's only by analogy. These are, part of the problem we have in dealing with these things is that it's a whole language, a whole vocabulary we don't have anymore. See, people used to be able to think in these terms as easily as you and I think in the materialist terms that we were handed growing up and in school and so forth, and that we get reinforced every day in the papers. And really, it's like learning a whole different language. It's a whole different way of looking at reality. It's completely different. And this is why when you read medieval writings and so on, or the writings of philosophers who perhaps were a bit later but who dealt in these areas, they're so hard to read. Why? They don't make much sense to us. Because they were dealing with a whole worldview that was completely centered on God and his dealings with the world. Whereas we are used to dealing with a worldview that sees the center of everything as man. Now, to the degree that we're conscious in our belief in God, we try to orient ourselves to him. But it's tough because we're using a whole thought process that is completely the opposite. So, anyway, let's go on. Now, having said all of that, we have to move into the I counted 3 sorts of beings that God created, rational beings. First and most important for tonight, but not for us in general, are the angels. Now, he created them before he created man. Angelos means messenger. And basically what he created them for was the administration of the world of matter, to run things, to keep things going. It's interesting to me that we tend to accept all sorts of processes without giving them a second thought. Electricity. You know, nobody knows what it is. We can describe it, and we use it, God knows, but we don't know what it is. That's true of an awful lot of things in our life. Scientists don't know what it is. They can give you all sorts of equations about it, but they don't know what they're dealing with. They just know that if they do a certain thing, something else results. And the result is the electricity, in this case. They don't know what it is. So you see, what keeps the planets in their courses? What keeps the seasons coming? What does all the, as it were, involuntary aspects of creation? Well, said the old theologians, the angels. They declared that every planet had its tutelary angel that sort of kept an eye on it. That the angels were the mechanism whereby God kept the universe running. Now also, however, they divided them into 9 choirs. One thing that you find in the old philosophy is that hierarchy was everywhere. There were always gradations in everything. Some things were greater than others, all the way down to the lowest rock. Everything had a place in that hierarchy. So, they spoke of the 9 choirs of angels. There were the seraphim, the cherubim, and the thrones, the three highest. And they spend all their time adoring God, pretty much. Never see a seraph running around generally, or a cherub, I should say, singular. Then, below them were three other choirs who were virtues, powers, dominions, yes. Thank you. Virtues, powers, and dominions. And they were the ones that did all the sort of running things. Although the dominions, some of them, we are told, had another interesting thing. They played guardian angel to countries. And then, the virtues, the archangels, and the angels. The angels are the lowest choir, and from them were recruited, and are recruited, the guardian angels, one of whom at least accompanies each of us. And, so they taught, if you rose up, if you became a king or a duke or a priest or something of that sort, you might get another guardian angel on top of the one you already had. But all the way through, from the bottom to the top, all of these angels were interested in doing God's will and nothing else. And bear something else in mind. You often hear this, boy, my little boy died, or my mother died, or somebody died, and now I've got my own angel watching over me. No, you don't. Presuming the individual made it to heaven, you've got a saint on your hands, but you don't have an angel. Because angels are not people. They never were, never will be. They are themselves, you know. There's your kitten over there. Is he a dog? Well, no, he's a cat. But he's not a dog then. No. Well, if he isn't a dog, what is he? He's a cat. It's a different sort of creature. This is very important because if you're raised on movies like most of us are, you get all kinds of weird notions about angels. And one of the oldest things that you keep getting is that they are in fact people. Remember, It's a Wonderful Life. Remember, and the angel who came to help Jimmy Stewart had lived in Dickens' London, and he was earning his wings and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, that's a real old idea. It goes all the way back to pagan days, but it's not true. Not true at all. All the angels earn their wings. Some of them may have lost them, but they all earned them when they were made. Such as they were, such as they have been. And I don't suppose I really need to tell anyone here that angels do not necessarily have wings. That's to give an idea of what they do. It's symbolic of their speed, their movement. Then again, I wouldn't tell you they don't have wings since I've never seen one. And because they have subtle matter, they can appear as they choose. So I suppose it would help you a great deal if they had wings, and if for some reason God decided you ought to see an angel, well then, you might very well see him with wings. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's their proper shape. You don't know what their proper shape is. Okay. Now, we come to another creature. And here, I bring this up. One thing you'll find in these talks is that I will not necessarily tell you things simply in order of their importance in classical theology. Sometimes I will tell you things because of their topical usefulness, to give you a Catholic slant on something that's a great deal in the news. So, now I'm going to get the chance to do that. What you're going to hear, I would never want to quiz anyone on. But nevertheless, it's something that's a great deal in the news and something that at least you can have kind of a Catholic answer for. How many here have heard about the wonderful contactee stories? Aliens. The Roswell incident. I went to college in Roswell. You betcha. Hangar 19. They've got dead aliens hidden there. It's true. They opened it up. There was Jimmy Hoffa. It was amazing. Actually, I was always told he was at the safe of the Andrea Doria, but never mind. Now, these stories of aliens, of abductees, of their interest in sexual matters, of their breeding with people, and all this kind of stuff, if you know your folklore, it reminds one of nothing so much as the little people And I don't mean Billy Barty and Michael Dunn. No. I mean the fairies. I mean elves. What say you? How could you speak of such things? It's fiction. It's New Age. It's whatever it is. Well, if St. Jerome could speak of it, I can. Ha! To say nothing of St. Joan of Arc and a lot of other folk. St. Jerome tells a wonderful story of St. Anthony. And St. Anthony, the abbot, was walking along one day, and what should he see in the desert but a fawn? Now, I don't mean Bambi. I mean one of those goat-footed, horned little things that played panpipes and ran through the fields of Greece. Well, St. Anthony immediately presumed it must be a demon, and sprinkled him with holy water and crossed himself. And instead of sizzling and doing the things that demons do, the fawn said to him, "Pray for me to God, great holy man." And at that point, St. Jerome goes on to explain a great deal about what this creature was. Now, mind you, St. Jerome wasn't the only one, but he certainly was one of the more authoritative ones to describe them. In a nutshell, what sort of a creature is it? We have only fragmentary reports, folklore, the writings of certain saints, etc. to tell us. But apparently, there is on this earth an intermediate sort of creature, subtle mattered as it were, sometimes good, sometimes bad, infinitely changeable, and in a certain sense irrelevant. Because what we learn in Revelation, you see, are the truths that we need to save our own souls. You won't get a lot of other things in Revelation. You won't get anything that isn't absolutely necessary to know. But the reason why it's important to bear this stuff in mind is because strange things happen. And how many times have I run into a New Age person, formerly a Catholic, or various other sorts of people saying, well, there's just no room in the church's worldview for these kind of phenomena. Well, there's no worldview, there's no room in the worldview of the church in the 1950s, perhaps. But there is in the patristic and medieval worldview. There's a lot of room for it. And more than that, explanation. What's evil? What isn't? And as to what these creatures may be, well, one thing you find out about them if you study enough of the stuff is that they're very mischievous, and some of them are downright evil, and some of them, like the thing encountered by St. Anthony, have aspirations to something better. So it's important to bear that in mind, because what happens if this should happen to you one day? You know, all of these contactees and so on, some of them are seeing something. Don't know what. I'd rather not know. With any luck, I never will. But where there's smoke, there's fire. What if you run into someone who comes preaching, as some of these people do? If you ever get the chance to go to some of these whole earth expos and whatnot, you'll find contactee booths, and they're just great. Now, so a lot of these people are nuts. Some of them are con artists and so forth. But a few of them aren't. And you must bear in mind that long, long ago, the church fathers were aware of such phenomena and had answers for it. So I tell you, that's the second type. And they're really not that important for our present purpose. What they're there for, what they're doing, what God's got in mind with them, who knows? That brings us to the third, and from our point of view, really the most important kind of creature. Rational creature. You know who that is? All together now? Man, yes, us. I know, you thought we weren't created. Well, no, we were, and we are here, taking up space and breathing. Now, we are an interesting creature indeed, because we're hybrids. Spiritual souls and physical bodies. And the two of them, in very intimate connection, interact one on the other. If you've got a sickness of soul, as it were, if you've got a deep mortal sin on your conscience, very often it'll affect you physically. And contrariwise, your body certainly will affect your soul in terms of sitting and so on in innumerable ways. It works back and forth. So we're very peculiar that way and very unique. I should tell you also that we have eternal souls. We live forever. But everything that lives, animals, vegetables, etc., all have souls of a sort. The thing is, they're not eternal. The soul in Latin is anima, from which we get the word animate. So, just again, this is parenthetical, but when one hears of ghosts of dogs and things like that, if there be any truth to it, what it simply means is that the thing which animated that dog hasn't broken up yet. How do they break up? I don't know. What happens to them? I don't know. And I could go on without a nose, but instead of doing that, I'll go back to this. Now then, in looking at angels and men and perhaps those other creatures, whatever they might be, there are three things that we have to bear in mind that distinguish us. The first is the primacy of the will over the intellect. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you. The will is the basic force of the personality. It is that which desires ultimately in you good or evil, which loves God, truth, or loves self. It is, in essence, the thing in you that loves. Whatever it be that you love, that is the basis of your whole personality, the basis of your being. Just as everything that was created in an act of love, at the root of it, that's what you are too. The question is, always, what is the object of that love? Now, what is the intellect? Well, the intellect is your rational capacity, the thing that draws in all sorts of stimuli from outside and makes judgments based upon that. Now, the Aristotelians will say that the intellect precedes, that is to say, forms, the will. That you cannot love the good unless you are taught to. That you cannot hate evil unless you are taught to. So spoke Aristotle. However, the Church Fathers, etc., the NPs, as we'll call them, for Neoplatonists, they taught it's the other way around. The will rather precedes the intellect. And what that means is that the intellect is formed and shaped and aimed, basically, by the will. That's why you've heard the phrase tabula rasa. Okay? Aristotle taught that when you're born, you're nothing. You're just a blank slate. Plato taught, no. You were born at the very essence, the very nub. You are born as you will be. It isn't that there can't be changes. But at bottom, you are what you are when you are conceived. We'll get to free will in a minute. Now, once that is said, the upshot of it is, in human terms, is simply this. And this is how we can tell which of the two schools is right. And this is what I'm going to tell you is considered heretical in philosophical circles. But I'll tell it to you anyway. If you want to gauge whether or not a philosophy has any validity, see if it actually corresponds to reality. I know what you're going to say. How dare I let reality intrude on philosophy? I'm sorry. But philosophy is a means to an end, not merely a way to get people doctorates. That's one. Philosophy is intended to help you understand, not to cloud the issue. That's something we tend to forget. I know, in tossing around all of these terms, I may have helped to cloud the issue unbearably. But nevertheless, there is a point to them, and there's a reason for them. All right. Here is how you can tell the difference. If the intellect preceded the will, then whatever you were taught as a child, your basic values and so on, you could never really deviate from. You just couldn't. How would you know? If you were a Catholic, you couldn't possibly apostatize if you'd always been taught. And if you weren't a Catholic, you could never convert. You just couldn't change your mind because you were taught. That's all there is to it. End of story. Whereas, if the will precedes the intellect, well then, to the degree that you love truth, to that degree, you will find it. To the degree that you don't, to that degree you won't. And if that were the case, well then, people could convert to Catholicism, and people could apostatize from Catholicism. And mind you, a lot of other things too, not just a question of whether or not one is Catholic, but you get the idea. So in looking at these two points of view, and looking at life as it's lived, it seems to me the will does indeed precede the intellect, simply on the basis of observable data. But I'll tell you parenthetically, there are a couple of other problems that arise if you believe that the will precedes the intellect. Well, I'm sorry, other way around, that the intellect precedes the will. One of them is that there isn't any free will. You're the victim of your upbringing. Sound familiar, anyone? It's what our society's based on. I'm society's victim. I can't help myself. The other problem you get is that God is not merciful. Why? Because if, as the church fathers taught, and as the church herself has defined 3 times, there is no salvation outside the church, then it means that those who aren't raised Catholic are in a bad way. And for what? For what? Because God didn't choose to have them born into Catholic households? And as we know, there's no such thing as converts, because, of course, the intellect precedes the will, and no one can ever change. We also know that all Catholics must be going to heaven, since you can't apostatize by the same token. So, in order to make up for that problem, a notion was cooked up. Invincible ignorance. Ever hear that phrase? It came about, it was actually a notion from moral philosophy, which basically stated that if you had been brought up with never being taught that something was a sin, say, stealing, you were brought up by gypsies, well then, you would not be responsible for it before the throne of God, if you died that way. That was the notion, and you could see that it has a certain real utility there. But what they did, in order to make up for the perceived, after the Aristotelian view became the predominant one in the church, and it's interesting if you compare these things historically, how it all fits in. History is something else philosophers don't like a great deal. I can't blame them. But what you see is that the whole notion of invincible ignorance as if you never come in contact with the church, if you're not raised in the church, and you don't become a Catholic before you die, you won't be held responsible. That notion was cooked up in dogmatic theology shortly after Aristotelianism became the primary philosophy in the church. Funny how that works. But you see, then you've got another problem, and that is that not only is God only just if you have invincible ignorance, he's also not all-powerful. Because he creates situations that he himself is incapable of affecting. You get, in a word, you introduce into the relationship of divine grace and free will, you introduce another factor, chance. Chance. And St. Thomas himself introduces this in the Summa. When he is talking about St. Thomas, of course, was the one who popularized Aristotelianism and made it respectable. He talks about the catechumen who's on his way to get baptized and then gets killed through some ill chance. Was God vacationing in Cuba? But you see, such a notion of chance in these affairs can only come in if one has accepted the Aristotelian materialist worldview. It only makes sense under those circumstances. And in fact, if you have that materialistic worldview, nothing else makes sense. It would have to be that way. So you see, although all the stuff I've been throwing at you tonight may sound very strange and bizarre and unrelated to real life, which you might make the case that it is if you take little individual elements of it, in point of fact, taken as a whole, it's all very important. Anyway, moving right along. So there you have the precedence of the will over the intellect. Now then you come into the question of bad will versus goodwill. Well, goodwill is the love of truth, the love of God. Bad will is the love of self. Now, having said that, you say that you have the phrase, God enlightens all men of goodwill. But here's the kicker. All of us sons of Adam, as a result of the fall, are mingled, goodwill and bad, all mixed up, in varying proportions. And those proportions vary from moment to moment sometimes. That's why all of us, good Catholics that we are, knowing all that we know, trek off to the confessional. And actually, I hate to break the news to you all. Maybe I've never sat in with any of you on your confession, so I don't know. But I've got things to confess when I go into the confessional. Me, the great Coulombe, writer of books, speaker of speeches, friend of the friendless, persecutor of the persecuted, or whatever. I myself actually have sins. Kirk is crushed. I'm sorry. The news has come. But this means that at some point, Charles A. Coulombe of that ilk is bad-willed, loves self over what he knows to be the truth. Because when you sin, that's what you do. You put yourself over God's law. And of course, the more you know it, the more culpable you are, which is why bad Catholics go deeper in heaven than anybody else. Deeper in hell, rather. Deeper in heaven. God, there's a line for you. Oh, no, deeper in heaven. I can't take it. Too much bliss. No. Yes. It gets tough. Yep. Wallowing in grace. Reeking of it. Well, anyway. But this is why bad Catholics go deeper in hell than anyone else. Because they're much more responsible. Their torments are worse because they deserve them more than anybody else. Anyway, moving right along. I just say that to the degree that you love truth more than self, to that degree you're good-willed, and vice versa. Now, we have one other point to consider here, and that is free will. Free will. You have a choice. You have tons of choices. Every one of us, every day, are given lots of choices that add a little bit more or a little bit less to our goodwill or our bad will. And every time you sin, you have a choice. If you don't have a choice, it's not a sin. That's the trick, Of course, then you've got to figure out to what degree did you not have a choice. But to every time you do something virtuous, you do a good deed. There too you had a choice. You could have said no. And our lives are the sum total. The basic orientation of our life is the sum total of these little choices that we make every day. It's quite amazing if you think about it. Now with the angels it was different, you see. It was different. Not having gone through our sort of fall, which we'll describe next week. Not being in the body the way we are, not having gross matter that's dependent on all sorts of other factors. They only had one choice. But the very fact that they had choice in one major matter, that they had the possibility of saying yea or nay and changing their natures thereby, that is what led the church fathers and so on to speak of subtle matter, because they could change. Matter implies the ability to change. However, having made one fundamental choice, they cannot change that. Because unlike ourselves, who live from moment to moment to moment, the angels live in eternity as God himself does. An act is an act, and it simply continues. So, it isn't just that way back in the beginning, St. Michael chose to serve God. He is always choosing at every moment of his existence to serve God. It isn't a once thing. It's an always thing, a continual thing. It made his nature what he is. It made him what he is. He and his choice are the same. as will be for us one day. Not now, but one day. But the thing to bear in mind is that God will not interfere with your free will. He'll give you all kinds of suggestions. He may give you some messages, pleasant or otherwise. He may do everything he can to influence you. But he will not break your will. And that is why heaven is eternal, and that is why hell is eternal. Because at the moment you become disembodied, your choice stands. And you've spent your whole life making it. You see. That's why the moment of death is so important. And that's why in the Hail Mary we always say, pray for us now and at the hour of our death. Because then the devils, who we'll talk about in a minute, really attack you. That's when you need grace. More than any other time, single time in your life. You need it at the hour of death, at the moment of death. Most of you, I think, perhaps have seen The Imitation of Christ, Thomas à Kempis. Thomas à Kempis will never be canonized. Not now, not ever. Why? Because he was a wicked, evil man and they found evidence of this? No. His life was fine. It's just when they dug him up, they found that he had come alive. He had revived in the coffin. He had chewed his nails, his fingers, and he had scratched and he had struggled. And thus there is the possibility that he may have despaired at the end. They don't know that. They don't know at all. But because they don't know, they can never canonize it. Canonization requires certainty. And for Thomas à Kempis, they will never have that certainty.
No miracles ever saved.
Don't know. You don't even get to that. You don't get to the miracles until you get everything else right. The miracles come later. So, unless they're so extraordinary they can't be ignored, and nothing like that has happened. Maybe there have been miracles attributed to him, but I don't know. I will tell you, though, that for him, unless it was something really tremendous, which it hasn't been, they won't even bother investigating miracles until that hurdle is overcome, and it can't be overcome because it would require knowledge that we're not capable of getting. But contrariwise, if there are deathbed despairs, there are also, as we all know, deathbed conversions. So this is a very, very interesting thing. It's quite something being alive, actually. I'm rather fond of it. Anyway, moving right along, I will just say also that hell is a monument to free will. God would not really love you as a rational being if he did not allow you to damn yourself for all eternity. God loves you so much, he will let you do that to yourself. He will let you choose not to love him. He will not break your will. It's tough love, but love nevertheless. The thing is, it's unsparing love, and it has nothing to do with feeling. That's why we have a hard time recognizing it as love. Anyway, now, the fall of the angels, the fall of the demons, I should say, who were angels, is the first important action beyond creation itself in our history. It got the ball rolling. The angels were given the choice to serve as God's messengers and administrative assistants, or not. But that serving, you see, was the sticking point. And as we know, Lucifer said, non serviam, I will not serve. And a third of the angels of heaven fell with him. Now again, when we sin, what do we basically do? We repeat that fall in a very, very, very minor key. I will not serve. I, a creature, will not be bound by the law of the Creator. I will do what I choose. End of story. Non serviam. Only with Satan it was a bit more impressive. And so he fell, and the devils with him. And hell was created to receive him. And the thing is, as I said earlier, people say, well, couldn't God forgive Satan? Well, no, because Satan could never repent. You see, he didn't just choose once upon a time, and he's always been a bad boy since. As with St. Michael, it is what he is, and he is always choosing now, present tense. Every satanically inspired thing, every sin, every pestilence, every war, every this, every that he's behind is a reaffirmation, a symbolism of his continuing non serviam. And he won't change. He can't change. And you could say, well, can he figure out now that he isn't going to win? It's not like that. They don't think in those terms. They do not have the distinction between thought and action that we have, the angels. They're all the same thing with them. They think they do. And their thought isn't diffused by all sorts of problems and conditions. They are what they are, and they remain ever true to their nature. Of course, the contrary-wise, that's why you never have to worry about your guardian angel finally giving up on you. You know, pal, you think I'm going to stick around with this stuff? Forget it. I mean, remember, you've always got an audience of one. Any sin you commit, apart from God, of course, any sin you commit, you get to break your guardian angel's heart again and again and again. Isn't that fun? You've got one fellow you can always, always be assured will be there to sit and watch you do these things. And yet, if he were a human being, of course, he'd say, this is my idea of a good time, sitting around while Bozo here tries to get himself to hell as quickly as he can, and in the stupidest ways imaginable. He doesn't even enjoy them. Not really. And I'm stuck with this for the term of his natural life? I don't think so. See ya. Well, luckily, for just the same reason that Satan can't repent, the guardian angel isn't going to finally give up on you in disgust. Which really shows you how inhuman he is. If you want to know just how different they are. Think of yourself with an assignment like that. Oh boy, that'd be a lot of fun. That's one way you could tell that the angels aren't souls. Listen, if It's a Wonderful Life with a real case, Clarence probably would have pushed Jimmy Stewart into the water. Jump! Let me out of here! Go ahead. He probably would have been given his wings for that. Anyway, little Capra bashing there. Sorry. Anyway, so having said all of that, heaven and hell, then, are the two great realities. Now, heaven is a state and a place. Hell is a state and a place. Beings that are there in either place take it with them. You see. If a demon comes up and, say, possesses that statue, runs around and makes poor Matthew scream, Satan! He doesn't feel better because he's out of hell. I'm out on leave. No. It goes with it because it's a part of what they are. It's the essence of what they are. If you go to hell, you wouldn't be happy in heaven. I know you'd be miserable in hell, but if you went to heaven, if you were plopped down in front of the throne just sitting there, you'd still be in hell. It wouldn't matter. And vice versa. If you go to heaven, well then, you could be sitting in the depths of hell. Once you have saved your soul, you could be sitting there. You would be united with God, and you know God is in hell. Oh yes, he's everywhere, in everything he created. But in hell, he's there as adversary. He's there as the enemy. And to the degree that they perceive him, they hate him all the more. So, these are important things to remember, because part of our problem today is that being very materialistic and so on, we tend to try to project what we see around us onto these ideas. So people think of hell as something deep in the earth, think of heaven as something out there. Well, both places are simply beyond. We have to get used to thinking of the created universe, space and time, all wrapped up together, as being a relatively small thing, as being something outside of which the real action is going on. I always use this simile. I know I used it last time, and I'll probably use it next time, but think of the ant crawling along in a house trying to comprehend human civilization. He can't. And if she were rational, if she had a brain, a mind rather, she would no doubt think of everything in relationship to her. You know, the tiles of the kitchen were obviously there for her to walk along, and so she walks along, never realizing that there actually is a pattern. And it looks like there isn't for where she is, but there is. The difference, of course, is that you really don't care very much for the ant and will probably step on her if you can, whereas God does care for us. And because he's infinite, loves us each individually. That's the other crazed thing. You know, St. Teresa of Avila said to our Lord when he appeared to her, "I am Teresa of Jesus." And he said to her, "Well, I am Jesus of Teresa." But the thing is, to the degree that we actually love of ourselves, to the degree that we're good-willed, to that degree, he's willing to reward each of us the same way. And that is heaven. That is heaven. A removal of the veils that cloud our lives here. Seeing reality as it really is, enjoying the fruits of our goodwill out of God's grace. All the yearnings that one feels for things one can't put a name on, they're yearnings for heaven. You ever notice that your anticipation of something is often, almost always in fact, greater than the actual reality? Funny how that works. When you're traveling, if even just for a minute before you go to bed, what do you think of the comforts of home? When you're home, what do you think of, if only for a minute before you go to bed, but the excitement of travel? You're never happy. Nothing is ever as good as it's cracked up to be. Why? Because nothing on this earth can satisfy you. And no one can satisfy you. Not really. Your friends will all fail you. The only consolation you've got for that is that you'll fail all of them. There's something for you. Lovers, you'll never be able to get to the bottom of them. A good marriage is a partnership, but it's rarely a meeting of minds. And even if it is, even when it is, there's only so far two human minds can meet. We're alone. And yet we yearn to be part of something. We yearn to be united with others. Well, we can't do it in the flesh. It's not possible. We have similes, we have marriage, we have friendship, all these things. But they don't satisfy by themselves. They can't. And this is why the life of the sinner, or the atheist, or the heretic, or whatever, is so bleak. It's why there's so much despair in the world, why there's no hope. Because people attempt to make themselves happy with creatures. Well, creatures can make you happy to a degree. But without the Creator, they run short. All your best friends, the woman you marry, what attracts you to them is some aspect of God reflected through them. Some aspect you yourself don't possess. At its best and at its highest. That's what attracts you to other people. And you know, it's a good thing to realize that. To look at the people you're fond of and say to yourself, now what? Gee, I wonder what aspect of God in them it is that I'm fond of. Why is that useful? Partly because it will deepen your appreciation of them, but also because it'll give you a clearer thought of God of what God is really like than anything else will. Mind you, it's not that the sum total of all your best cronies put together is like God. No. But it helps you think a little bit more about him, and it helps you to actually love him. Not just fear him, which is important. It's the beginning of wisdom. Keeps you on the straight and narrow sometimes when you can afford to think about it. But it helps you to begin to see how he can be loved. So, anyway, we're getting to the end here, gang. Wow. It's important to bear in mind, again, as we saw with the guardian angel, that the angels and the demons are all around us at all times. In this room, in your bedroom when you're alone, everywhere. St. John Chrysostom said, if we could see what reality were really like, we should faint dead away with fright. And he was a terribly holy man, and no doubt could see reality as it really is. Because, see, I said earlier today that to clear away the fogs to a degree, it isn't just enough to have a finely developed mind. You also have to develop holiness. Intellect without holiness is like a computer without any input. You just can't see. And this is why, if you want, again, an historical index for the decline of thought in the church, notice that sometime about the later Middle Ages, before that time, in the patristic era, the early Middle Ages, and into the high Middle Ages, the greatest scholars of the church were also the greatest saints. Holiness and scholarship were considered to be very tightly connected. Learning, human knowledge, and divine knowledge. But after that period, the two start to get separated. The very idea of, well, simple people are the holiest, or contrariwise. And mind you, today, well, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the notion that somehow sanctity and stupidity are inherently related, or intelligence, advice, are inherently related. It's completely wrong. It just shows how far we've declined. No. The more you know, the holier you have an obligation to attempt to become. You see. That's something we've lost sight of. And again, it's a result of this change in philosophy, I do believe. Anyway, we have come now to the last thing which I have to touch upon. Now, I hope that having said all of this stuff tonight, you will see that all of reality is interrelated in ways that we cannot see with all the rest of reality. Everything is connected. A large part of our unhappiness, of our being alone, is the fact that we can't see that. You know? The whole notion of the communion of saints, the church triumphant in heaven, the church suffering in purgatory, the church militant here on earth, all being bound together by invisible ties and so on. I'm getting beyond myself here because, of course, the church comes in later in another talk. But nevertheless, this interrelatedness, this interconnectedness is a very, very important concept. And while these strange and odd terms I've been throwing at you are, as it were, the building blocks of that worldview, that's the sum total. And its practical result is this. That words and gestures and actions in the physical realm can have an effect upon the spiritual. It's not a two-way street. Well, now then, gentlemen, I've come to the end of the lecture.